In this lecture, we begin our meta-narrative starting in an obvious place, creation itself, focusing particularly on Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, though we must remember that the doctrine of creation continues throughout the story, throughout the rest of the Bible. Now, we're all aware of the discussions and debates about creation in Genesis 1, and sometimes I regret having to begin teaching the Bible with Genesis 1 because of the controversy. It's like jumping into the deep end. So I want to pause here and talk about the importance of context, what we had mentioned in the introductory lectures. You'll recall that we had three types of context. There's the literary context, and so we need to examine things like grammar and structure and genre. And though we won't be getting into the nitty-gritty details at this stage, though we can certainly discuss this in the forums, one thing I would suggest if you're interested in this, look at different English translations, especially of the first few verses of Genesis 1, and that'll signal that there's a lot of debate going on by the scholars who put together those translations. The historical context brings to mind that we're dealing with an ancient Near Eastern audience. That's what A&E stands for. Both the author and the original audience are part of a certain historical context, and that's going to shape the way things are described and what they would have thought about by terms and concepts. It also reminds us that Israel is in the context of pagan neighbors who also had creation stories, and most Old Testament scholars think that's a huge piece to bring to wrestling with Genesis chapter 1. And finally, there is the theological context. Well, we'll be discussing creation primarily from Genesis 1 and a little bit from Genesis 2. You've got to realize that the doctrine of creation is developed throughout the scripture, and a full discussion of creation would bring in both Old and New Testament text, wrestling with these things. But my point in talking about context and highlighting the importance of context is that, at least in my own study and reflection on this, one of the big conclusions I've come to is that when we go to Genesis 1, we should focus more on the who and the why than the how and the when. Now, I personally am involved and interested in those discussions and debates about creation, those things that often focus on the how and the when, but I never want to forget that ultimately, this is a worship text. This is a text that we are to go to and fall on our knees before this awesome creator. The feel of the text, the cadence, suggests this kind of exalted posture that we should have. I once had a mentor say that if we go to Genesis 1 only to fight the evolutionists, then the devil has us right where he wants us. And there's so much truth to that, to never forget that this is to draw us first and foremost to worship. We can have the discussion and debate, but let's keep it in proper perspective. Now, one thing that's not that much debated is the overall structure of Genesis chapter 1. We begin in the first couple verses with what I'm calling a prologue. There's lots of differences and debates about how to put these verses together chronologically, how to even translate them, but there's some kind of introduction with God created the heavens and the earth, which is usually taken as a merism that denotes everything. And in verse 2, you have three quote-unquote problems. The earth is dark, the earth is formless, and the earth was empty. And so the 6 days of creation, at least one of the purposes of that account is to undo the quote-unquote problems of verse 2 so that life can be livable on earth. And so the first 3 days deal with the days of forming to overcome the formless earth in verse 2. On day 1 you have the creation of light, which overcomes the darkness. And days 4, 5, and 6 are days of filling, where you get the inhabitants. And most scholars see a connection horizontally as you're looking at this schematic here, that there's a connection between day 1 and day 4, between day 2 and day 5, between day 3 and day 6. Whatever else we want to say about this, it does show a very ordered text, very deliberate text. This was put together with a lot of thought and care. And at the end of this account, we have God resting on day 7, which shows that he is utterly satisfied with his own work, and he's ready now to rule his creation. I would like to highlight 3 aspects of Genesis 1, what I'm calling the theological agenda. And these are things that I think we should all agree on before we go on to any other discussion or debate. And the first one sounds like a Sunday school answer, but I think that's the point of the text. The first agenda of Genesis 1 is to glorify God. He's there in the beginning. It's often said that if you can believe the first 4 words of the Bible, then you could believe just about anything. So as I stated before, Genesis 1, first and foremost, is to exalt this God who is created. But who is this God? In Genesis 2:4, we have 2 Hebrew terms describing him. He is Yahweh Elohim, or in most English translations, the Lord God in all caps. And these 2 labels actually specify 2 different things about God and his character. Yahweh is actually his name. It's his covenant name. He is Yahweh, the God of Israel. He is Yahweh, the God who redeemed his people out of Egypt. So when Israel and other nations would have heard the name Yahweh, they would have seen the connection between this God and his specific people. Elohim, translated God or gods, depending on the context, is really a generic designation for deity. It's not a name, it's a designation. But here in the context, rather than focusing on covenant, it focuses on God as the world's creator. Just to give a New Testament analogy, there's something very similar here between Yahweh Elohim, which gives this built-in tension between God's covenant focus and him being interested in the whole world. You think about the New Testament with Jesus being called both Lord and Christ, or Lord and Messiah. Lord speaks about his universal lordship overall, and then Christ or Messiah focuses on his specific work as the covenant mediator, and of course there as the Son of David. Before we try to get into the details of what is it about God that's being glorified, how does it highlight that positive view of Yahweh Elohim? The second theological agenda, and this is one that will not be as familiar to many Christians, there seems to be an implicit challenge to pagan views of cosmic origins. We now know through archaeological discovery that there were other creation stories floating in the air that Israel certainly would have been aware of, both from Mesopotamia and from Egypt and from the land of Canaan. And a lot of study has gone into this, and there has become a certain consensus that Genesis 1 seems to be reflecting and going against, in some ways, those other creation stories. That is, Genesis 1 is shaped, I don't know if we want to use the word polemic, some do, but it certainly is aware of these other stories and trying to counter them. And so really what you're going to do is you're going to see a lot of similarities between Genesis 1 and these other creation stories, but also you're going to see a lot of differences. And that's going to highlight the theological differences, or what I'm calling here the theological agenda. On the right, you see a image of Tiamat, who is the Babylonian sea goddess. And you can study further the story of Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story. And it's about a fight between 2 gods, Tiamat, pictured here, and Marduk. And eventually in the creation story, Marduk will defeat Tiamat, and it's in the middle of that battle that creation takes place. It's really an accident. He takes half of the body to make the heavens and half to make the earth, and there's a lot of bloodshed, there's a lot of manipulation in these pagan stories. Humans are created to be slaves of the gods eventually, to do the work for the gods. And so it's a much different picture of what's taking place. When you read through that story and we have some discussion, this will make a whole lot more sense. Below you see something of a picture of what the world may have looked like or seemed, how ancient people would have perceived things. And here's a better picture. Without going into all the details, the point I want to make here is that when we look through the Bible and we try to understand their conception of the universe, it's very similar to how all of Israel's neighbors would have perceived it. This is how everybody in the ancient world kind of thought about things. There's a three-tiered universe. We, human beings, live in the middle part of that on earth, but there's a world up there and there's a world below. And a lot of these images come up not only in the Hebrew Bible, but also in ancient depictions and in other cultures. So the point is, while Israel shared the physical conception of the world with her neighbors, that only helps set the platform so that the theological differences can be. So here's a list of the types of things that, on one hand, glorify God, Yahweh Elohim, the God of Israel, but in contradistinction to the other nations and the other gods. So, like in a good debate, it is promoting one side, Yahweh, and it is at least implicitly denigrating the other gods, tearing down the other positions. Obviously, the one huge distinction between Israel's view and others is that in Israel there is monotheism, there is one God. And because there's only one God who is supreme above all, there's no fight, there's no competition, there's no need to manipulate. What he does perfectly. Things are created according to plan. There's a quote-unquote perfect product guaranteed by the hovering Spirit of God in Genesis 1:2. God simply needs to speak rather than fight in order to create the things he wants to create. There's a structure, there's a harmony, there's an order. Just reading through Genesis 1 gives you that sense. When I think about the genre of Genesis 1, it reminds me a lot of the Declaration of Independence. There's a cadence, there's an exalted sense there to draw you to worship. Human beings are created as God's image bearers rather than his slaves. So this is a very humanitarian text. Exalts human beings above all the other worldviews that were around then and I would say now. And God is so pleased with his work, he can rest, which is in contradistinction to the continual restlessness of the pagan deities. So this brings us to our third theological point, and that is to celebrate humanity as the climax of creation, the Imago Dei. There's all sorts of textual clues in Genesis 1 to show that this is the climax of creation. Human beings are created last, as if everything that was done before then was preparing the place for this special part of God's creation. Human beings are created with the special word bara, to create, which only shows up a couple other times in the text, but we see it 3 times in relation to human beings. There's a lot more words, a lot more verses taken up with this aspect of creation. In fact, there's divine deliberation. Let us make man in our image. Whatever you think the us is, that highlights a distinction. And of course, to be able to use the words of image and likeness and what God will do with human beings in the context of his creation, all go to show that this clearly is the climax, and human beings are special in the midst of the rest of the creation. We need to ask the question, what is the meaning of image of God? Because there is some debate about this. The popular notion is that image of God has to do with certain attributes, ontological categories. Since we are like God, we must be like him in a certain list of things. And many of the popular ones are here, things that I'm calling resemblance or relationship. God is X, therefore humans are X. That's the logic to this position. This is popular not only by lay people, but this is what philosophers and systematic theologians usually focus on. But you need to realize there's a problem on these popular views, one that is challenged by most Old Testament scholars who wrestle with the language in its own context. And just to ask certain questions, I want to put a few keys here, a few kind of filters that helps us to see why there might be a problem to the popular view here. I'll work backwards through this list. Unique, that means the Bible says that human beings are alone the image bearers of God. And so whatever image of God means, it has to separate humans from animals. And when I look at the popular list, it's hard not to think that animals in some sense have intelligence or emotions or whatever. So it's fuzzy. If this is what image of God is, it's a bit fuzzy that human beings are image of God and animals are not. This isn't a qualitative difference. It's supposed to be a real categorical distinction. When you think about the key equal, that means all human beings are equally image bearers of God. Doesn't matter about their age, their environment, their background, and so on. And again, when I look at the list under the popular view, we are not all equally intelligent or rational or emotional and so forth. So again, there seems to be a problem with focusing on the definition of image of God on these sorts of things. But the real problem is the key that I'm calling actual. And what I mean by that is that the Bible describes human beings as 100% holy images of God even after the fall. The Bible does not say we've lost the image or that we're partial images. You either are an image bearer of God or you are not. That's how the Bible describes it. Genesis 9:6, Genesis 5, when in the genealogy of Adam. Think of James in the New Testament that speaks about being made in the likeness of God. So the Bible seems to say you either are or not, and that the fall does not affect one being an image bearer of God. But clearly the fall affected our intelligence, rationality, emotions, and so on. And so there seems to be a real problem with this popular view as it's stated. And so most Old Testament scholars take a different view, what I'm calling here the biblical view, and that is one of rule. Image of God is less an ontological thing that we have certain attributes like God, but that we are given a certain status. We are given a certain responsibility and privilege to rule. And there's three reasons that Old Testament scholars tend to favor this view. First is the biblical text itself. When Genesis 1:27 says that, so God created man in his own image, in the image of God he created him, male and female he created them, the very next verse, God blessed them and God said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish and the birds and every living creature that moves on the earth. Therefore, there's a close connection between man being God's image bearer and this task handed to man to rule over the rest of God's creation. A much more functional idea. The second reason is really a matter of vocabulary. The word image is used in the ancient world to describe someone or something that represents someone else. So for instance, if a king takes his army and defeats another nation, but then has to leave to go fight another battle, maybe across the empire, we know that the king would often set up an image, a statue, called an image, in place so that these people who were just conquered would stay in subjection, because the belief was that the spirit of the god was infused into that statue or that image, and the people would stay put. And so the point is that an image is something that represents someone else. It's like an ambassador from the United States going to the United Nations. That person speaks on behalf of the United States. His or her words are not her own, but they're speaking on behalf of a nation. And so you're representing, you're standing in place of. And so this idea is that God is the king, but we are his under kings and queens. We are his viceroys, his vice regents, having a job to do, a task to do, to rule over the rest of creation. And the final reason for this is that this view passes those keys, those things we just looked at in order to evaluate the popular view. Since we've been given a status, it's only us and not the rest of creation. It's God's own election, his own choice. And because it's a status, we are equal in this as all human beings. It's not about the ability to perform image of God well, but it's about the status. I am a dad, whether I am a good dad or bad dad, but I am a dad, 100% father, no matter how well I perform the job. And that's why we can still be image bearers after the fall. Certainly the fall affects our ability to perform the tasks we've been given as God's image bearers, but we're still his image bearers. We still have that responsibility to rule and to subdue. Now, I would play nice at the end here and sneak in these other things because I do think our intelligence, rationality, creativity, and so forth, our tools are things that God has given human beings in order to perform the task of image bearer. But I think it's helpful to make a distinction in terms of definition. So we stand back and see what God has created us to be. God is separate. He's transcendent over all of his creation, but he has taken one piece of his creation, human beings, and elevated them to a different status. So we are go-betweens. And so we do have a series of relationships where we have been created with a special relationship to God himself. And before the fall, that is seen intact in Genesis 2, where God is walking in the midst of the garden. There's a relationship to the rest of the world. So as God's image bearers, we are to rule and subdue, and this could be translated into everything we do in terms of our work. We can include politics, care for the environment, everything we do in the created order, functioning as God's image bearers. And certainly in Genesis 2, before the fall, we see that functioning well as Adam is over the animals and he's working the ground. He's doing exactly what he's called to do. There's a horizontal relationship symbolized there by Adam and Eve in the garden. There's this fellowship, there's this relationship with other human beings, which is all intact, of course, before the fall. And there's a recognition, a self-confidence that's given to human beings. And again, I just want to emphasize that the biblical worldview, the biblical image of humanity, raises our understanding of human beings far greater than any other worldview. It's a very humanitarian, human-focused idea. So we've been talking a lot about Genesis 1 in its own historical context, in that it is challenging other worldviews, other ideas about creation. And I think that's the level that we can, quote unquote, translate this to our own day. If Genesis 1 is something of a clash of worldviews, then it invites us to take these themes from creation, to battle it out in our own clash of worldviews today. And so you'll see the three middle rows there, where on one hand, I'm affirming certain things. God's direct hand in every phase of creation. He creates good and with a purpose. And there's a distinction between creator and creation. And those 3 points cut against all kinds of isms that we run into even in our day. You may or may not know what all of these labels refer to. This is where your worldview class is going to be very helpful. But when we see these things in our world, in the world of ideas, Genesis 1 and the biblical doctrine of creation gives us a platform to combat those things. The top row, authorial agenda, and the bottom row on the special creation of humanity is getting into more of the specifics of these debates about origins and creation that we have. As I've stated before, we need to put the focus, the spotlight where the Bible does. And I'm concerned that we make sure that secondary issues remain secondary. Doesn't mean there's no room for discussing these things, but let's be conscious and careful about cutting fellowship off with fellow believers who differ on these secondary issues. And I would say at the bottom that Genesis 1 and 2 does speak about a special creation of humanity. And I would allow all kinds of views that affirm that. And so when it comes to the issue of evolution, this is my own personal opinion, that there are some evolutionary theories that affirm special creation, and there's some that don't. And I would make a distinction between those. And this isn't a class getting into these things, but let's be careful, let's be mature, let's have the discussion, really look at the details of somebody's view before we wipe them out completely with a given label. There's also implications for our view of humanity, or what's called anthropology, from the Greek word anthropos, human being. And this is a list that won't be shocking to you, but I think the biblical text affirms these things, and you could add to the list. You could talk about these things. God's direct involvement, as we've seen, the fact that human beings are superior over creation. So if you have a choice between running over a squirrel in the road or killing your child in the back seat, it's an obvious choice. We protect human beings over creation. Doesn't mean that we go out of our way to crush or to dominate in such a way that hinders the rest of God's creation. I think Christians ought to be on the front lines of the environmentalist movement and the human rights, or whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the day, we have to affirm the superiority of human beings over the rest of creation. There's an inherent dignity to being human, and so we need to protect that dignity. All humans, it doesn't matter about their race, their color, their background, and those things. So this affirms a lot of those human rights that we're all sensitive to. Having said that, there is a distinction between male and female, and we need to keep that distinction. And this is one of the big challenges going on in our day with the issues of gender and sexuality. I'm not here getting into the debate about gender roles as much as that there is a distinction biblically between men and women. We need to affirm human procreation. It is a fallen world when people are cry because they are having children. The real reaction is there should be distress when we're not able to have children. And so we need to exalt that act of procreation and welcome children into this world. There's the wholeness of human personhood. We didn't talk about this, but this gets into discussions about the meaning of soul and those types of things. I would just emphasize that in Genesis 2:7, we are created nefesh chaya, living souls. It's not that we have souls, we are souls. There's something more integrated into what makes us human than is often realized. And then finally, we can talk about the sanctity of life. And I would include those who are in the womb in this. This is being affirmed in my mind in the biblical worldview. The sanctity of work. Human beings were working before the fall, and so we need to celebrate work and the accomplishments of work. Yes, the fall makes it more difficult, and we never are fully satisfied because things fall apart, but we should find enjoyment in the work that God has given us. And we need to stress gender equality. If men are kings, then women are queens, and we need to work together equally in being God's image bearers. And I may also give a nod to apologetics to think about implications. And this is just something I offer to reflect on. I'm still reflecting on it. God is called Yahweh Elohim, and we talked about that. On one hand, this emphasizes God's covenant role. On the other hand, him as creator. So these twin themes of creation and covenant, which will go for the rest of the Bible, there's an interesting tension there to think about both angles. And what I would want to stress is an and, not an or. That there are times to focus one or the other, but we need to see it from both angles. So there's times to really stress the label Christian, and there's times that we can cooperate because we are part of the human race. It's not just about the church. There's times we emphasize that, but there's also participation in the world. This is where I would say we want to be evangelicals and not fundamentalists. There is a difference between natural and special revelation, or might call general and special revelation. The Bible is unique and it's special, but it doesn't mean we don't learn things about God and His world from science, from human behavior, from observation and experience. Those things need to be seen as working together, cooperating rather than always set apart. And if you know these nerdy terms, presuppositionalism and evidentialism, again, I would stress the need for both angles in apologetics. If you don't know those terms, then God bless you. You're more normal than the rest of us.